So the new scheme which is proposed in the Children and Families Bill that's currently before Parliament does change the law in relation to disabled children and children with special educational needs in significant ways. But it's not, in my view, a radical departure from what we've got at the moment. There will still be duties to assess. There will then be a duty to decide whether provision is needed, and if provision is needed, then it will have to be provided. Having said that, some of the really important changes include having a single process from 0 to 25, as opposed to the disjointed process we have at the moment. So there is already a duty to have education assessments and plans in place up to 25 through the learning difficulty assessment under Section 139A of the Learning and Skills Act 2000. But that's not very well understood, and the links between that and the statementing duty are very poorly understood and very poorly implemented. So to have a single process from 0 to 25, in my view, is potentially very helpful, although there is, of course, a question as what happens from 26 onwards. There's still going to need to be effective transition planning for young people in their mid-20s. The other area that's caught a lot of attention is the idea of a single education, health and care plan replacing the statement. Now, initially that was only going to have any legal force in relation to education, but in the committee stage the government has put down an amendment which means that there will be a duty to provide the health provision that's set out in the plan. Although at the moment there will only be a power to include any health provision in the plan, not a requirement to do so. So I do have some concern that certain areas will not put health provision into the HC plan in order to avoid triggering the duty to provide. But if that can be ironed out, then it will be a very important step forward, because there hasn't ever been a clear statutory duty to make individual health provision for a particular disabled child in the way that there is under the statementing duty for education. And also that there is under Section 2 of the Chronically Sick and Disabled Persons Act 1970 for social care, which is also poorly understood. So that could be a huge step forward if local areas comply with the spirit of the legislation and don't exclude health from the plans in order to avoid triggering the duty to provide. So 0 to 25 provision, more joined up provision we hope to see, important new duties around joint commissioning and cooperation, and a very important duty which will make academies and free schools maintained schools for the purposes of this scheme, which means that they won't be treated any differently than a mainstream secondary school or a local authority special school, and they'll have the full set of duties, which will be an extremely helpful piece of clarification. So those are what I think might be the key elements of the bill as it currently stands. It is really important to bear in mind, though, that this kind of legislation is often changed very significantly as it goes through Parliament, and we need to wait and see what the final act looks like before we can properly assess what the changes are going to be to the SEN and the disability scheme. Alongside the bill, the government, to its credit, has published an indicative draft code of practice, because there was a lot of concern that the detail of the current system, much of it resides in the SEN code of practice, and we wouldn't be able to tell whether the changes were positive or negative until we saw what the government was planning to put into the new code of practice. But from its name you can tell that it's at a very early stage, and if you read the draft indicative code, it is full of references to content to be added at a later date as things are worked through. So it's hard to say at this stage what the new code of practice will end up looking like. But this is a real opportunity for parent forums, because it is out for consultation and will be formally consulted on with a timescale that's to be announced. So parent forums really must engage with the draft code of practice and put in representations to the government. As many forums as possible need to respond to that consultation, set out what the concerns are, and highlight where any gaps arise in their view in the draft code. And organisations like Contact a Family, but also IPSI and the National Autistic Society and others will produce briefings about it to help parent forums understand what the concerns might be, I'm sure. But there's nothing that can substitute for the forums actually getting together and reading the draft code and sharing concerns and then putting those forward in a response to the department. And my view is that that's likely to be listened to, because the government does want to get this right. And by publishing such an early version, it's creating a space and an opportunity for changes to be made as a result of feedback, and parent forums are perfectly placed to provide that. One of the things that I've heard the most positive reaction about in relation to the indicative draft code of practice is how much it says about local authorities having to work with parent forums, having to work with groups of young people as well, and really trying to embed a culture of participation in the way in which the SEN system works. And that has always been there underlying a lot of the messages in the current scheme, but it's incredibly helpful, I think, to have that spelt out so explicitly and to be there up front from the beginning in the draft code of practice. And parent forums really can use all of that language and all of those messages to reinforce their status, really. And in local areas where the local authority may not be so willing to work with the parent forum, it's very helpful to have that right backed up by a statutory code of practice that the local authority has to comply with unless it's got good reason not to do so. And it's very hard to see what good reason there could be to not work with the local parent forum. So it's a really useful tool, and it's a very useful message generally that participation isn't an optional extra or a nice to have. It's supposed to be embedded in the new SEN system from the very word go. There's been some concern about the language that's used in the draft code of practice and also in some of the draft regulations as well, and about possible differences between terms like should and must. The obvious difference is that if regulations or statutory guidance says something must be done, then it has to be done. That creates a duty to do it unless there's a good reason not to do so. If something should be done, there's an implication that it's in some way optional, because it may be possible not to do it. It may merely be a recommendation. Now, the code of practice can't change the law. So if the Act, when it goes through, creates a duty to do something, and the code only says that it should be done, then that doesn't make a difference. It still must be done. But it will be very unhelpful if the code of practice doesn't properly reflect where there are duties to do things by using mandatory language. And that may well be feedback that the forums want to give to the department, to say that the language should be tightened up in areas where there is actually a duty to act in a certain way. Then terms like must, should be used so that that's clear. Well, where guidance and statutory guidance, including codes of practice, uses language like should, which suggests that something is recommended, the implication is that there's a power to do something, and that the government is saying that power generally should be used. Or perhaps that there's a general duty, for example, Section 17 of the Children Act 1989, which is a duty to all children in need, not for any particular child, a right to a service. If that's accurate, if the guidance is accurately reflecting the law, then it's for parent forums to try and persuade local areas, local authorities, to do what the guidance is recommending. And that can be political persuasion, or it could potentially be legal persuasion if it will be irrational or unfair or unreasonable not to act in accordance with the guidance. But if the guidance doesn't accurately reflect the law, then it can't change the law, and the guidance will need to be changed in order to reflect what the law requires. And if that is the case, then parent forums need to be drawing that to the department's attention and need to be raising concerns about whether it's correct to use language like should in the code of practice, or if in fact stronger language like must should be used to accurately reflect where there's a legal duty. So one of the most interesting aspects of the proposed reforms, and possibly the newest as well, is the duty that's going to be placed on clinical commissioning groups to provide the health services that are set out in the Education, Health and Care Plan. There is a slight concern that there's only a power to include health provision in the plan, not a requirement. And so it may be that in certain areas, limited or no provision is actually specified in the plan in relation to health. But if if the duty is being complied with properly, if the spirit of the duty is being respected, then health provision will be assessed as being necessary, will be included in the plan, and there will then be a specific duty to provide it, which reflects the duty under Section 3 of the NHS Act 2006, which already exists. That's potentially a very important change, because parents who have children with statements will know that it's only the educational provision in the statement that can be enforced. So it could be very useful to have a single document that sets out education and health provision, which then there is an equal duty, it seems to me, on the local authority on the one hand, the CCG on the other, to actually make that provision happen for the child each and every day. The big question then is, what about the social care provision? Because it's supposed to be an education, health and care plan. And that's really where we need to wait and see what the final legislation looks like. Because as it stands at the moment, there will be no duty under this new Act to put in place the social care provision in the plan. But it may be that actually there's a duty under the Chronically Sick and Disabled Persons Act 1970, if the plan is reflecting what it's necessary to provide, which it must be, then implicitly the duty under the 1970 Act arises. So that is a very complex area, and it needs to be worked through, and I hope that what we'll see in the end is clear duties on the face of this new Act to provide the education provision, the health provision and the care provision, so that each area of provision is treated in the same way, because they're all equally important to making sure that disabled children and their families get to lead ordinary lives, which is what the whole purpose of this legislation should be.